Madam President, back in September, the small little Texas border town, Del Rio, Texas, was thrown into the national spotlight. This is a small town on the U.S.-Mexico border of 35,000 people. And over the course of several days, they had 15 to 20,000 Haitian migrants show up camping out underneath a bridge. Migrants huddled under the bridge to escape triple-digit temperatures. It's still hot in September in Texas. And they had minimal access to sanitation, to food, and clean water. The images of this crisis looked like they were taken from a third world country, not from the United States of America. This massive surge should not have caught the Biden administration off guard. As a matter of fact, they should know that their policies have incentivized and encouraged this sort of influx of humanity across our border. Border Patrol had been asking their leadership for more resources as far back as June, but come September, those resources weren't available, and despite the warnings, the Biden administration was completely unprepared. So what is the Border Patrol supposed to do when you see this mass influx of humanity come across the border for which the administration is completely unprepared in a town that lacks the infrastructure to deal with this influx? Well, the Border Patrol did what they needed to do. They were pulled off the front lines to provide humanitarian relief. But what that means is it leaves huge stretches of the border unprotected against illegal immigration, or perhaps even more dangerous, illegal drug smuggling coming across the border. And the criminal organizations that operate these smuggling operations, whether they're migrants or they're drugs, they understand this. This is part of their game plan. But it's like they're playing three-dimensional chess while the United States government is playing checkers. It just is not a fair fight and fair matchup. But so far, that has not apparently sunk in to the Biden administration. Fortunately, we did have some organizations like the Valverde Border Humanitarian Coalition step up to feed, house, and arrange transportation for these migrants. You can imagine what the challenge was just to feed 15 to 20,000 people. There wasn't a porta potty to be had for 300 miles after they consolidated there to deal with the sanitation issues alone. If not for the dedicated Border Patrol agents, Customs and Border Protection in Del Rio, this crisis could have been much, much worse. As a matter of fact, the sector chief of the Del Rio sector told me the fact that they did not have a loss of life was a miracle. I want to publicly express my gratitude to those who, in countless ways, went above and beyond the call of duty to mitigate this crisis the best they did. They don't receive the gratitude they deserve, but they need more than our gratitude. They need our help. After the makeshift camp under the bridge was cleared, the national news died down, the reporters and cameras went away, but the problem did not. It's not a question of if there will be a repetition of what we saw in Del Rio in September. It's a question of when, because none of the reasons why those 15 to 20,000 Haitian migrants showed up has been fixed. Last week, I visited Del Rio, and I met with leaders in the community who told me about the challenges they're facing. The new chief of the Border Patrol sector, I mentioned a moment ago, told me that while there were 15 to 20,000 migrants in that one episode in September, they're still averaging about 1,000 migrant encounters a day. So in about 2 weeks' time, they have the equivalent of what we saw last September in terms of the 15 to 20,000 migrants, because they're still getting 1,000 people a day, yet it doesn't command the attention of the news media and of the nation like this incident in September did. So things are not getting any better. Agents are still being diverted from their normal duties to care for migrants, including unaccompanied children, leaving, again, vast swaths of the border unprotected, through which drugs are run, drugs that last year alone took the lives of more than 100,000 American citizens, because the vast majority of fentanyl, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and other illegal drugs come across their southwestern border. And the cartels understand that if you flood the zone and overwhelm the capacity of the local border patrol to deal with it, you're going to leave unprotected areas. And that's exactly the plan of these transnational criminal organizations. I spoke with a group of about 30 Border Patrol agents at muster. That's when they show up for their shift, from one shift to the next, where they learn sort of what's the latest information they needed to know before they went out on patrol. And when they were asked to raise their hand if they would be working out in the field that day, patrolling the border, not a single hand was raised. That's because these 30 Border Patrol agents were going to be pushing paper and processing migrants instead of out on the front lines protecting our country against illegal immigration and the influx of illegal drugs. Again, the cartels understand this. This is part of their game plan. But apparently the Biden administration and the powers that be here in Washington, D.C. are completely oblivious to what the push and pull factors are for illegal immigration and illegal drugs across our border. These men and women of the Border Patrol are brave professionals, and they'd normally be out on the front lines stopping dangerous people and substances from sneaking across the border. But now they're primarily tackling administrative duties, processing paperwork, watching children, transporting migrants, and trying to clean up the mess created by a failed border security policy by the Biden administration. This is a dangerous situation that puts our entire country at risk. While these highly trained and dedicated agents are pushing paper, who knows what's coming across the border? There's a clear and urgent need for Congress to take action to address this crisis in a meaningful and responsible way. And everybody from Secretary Mayorkas on down says that this is what is required under current policies. So my humble suggestion is those policies need to change. And that means only Congress can pass new laws to change those policies. But so far, our Democratic colleagues, especially the leadership, have shown zero interest in engaging at all on how to solve this problem. They've spent the bulk of this year trying to figure out how you could break the rules of the Senate to reform our entire immigration system using the budget. This process wasn't designed to fast-track partisan legislation or to circumvent responsible policymaking. It's not a loophole that allows the majority party to do whatever it wants. The Senate parliamentarian has already confirmed several times that our Democratic colleagues cannot use this budget reconciliation process to grant citizenship to millions of undocumented immigrants. But they keep coming back, and for some reason, the very people who would benefit from these policies don't seem to hold our Democratic colleagues accountable for showing up empty-handed, notwithstanding their promises of help to people who are here in undocumented status. Our Democratic colleagues continue arguing among themselves about how much of the population should receive some form of legal status without putting 1 ounce of thought or ounce of effort into how the population got so big in the first place. They're certainly not considering what we need to do to prevent the number of people living in the shadows from continuing to increase. I've said repeatedly, there is a clear and urgent crisis on our southern border. And President Biden and his administration have proven to be either unwilling or incapable of addressing it. The numbers tell the tale. Last year, border crossings hit a record high. More than 1.7 million border crossings in a single year. That's a 30-year high. The backlog of immigration court cases has grown to nearly 1.5 million. That's 1.5 million pending court cases before immigration judges. And the average wait time for a single case to be decided is more than 2.5 years. Congress has a duty to take action to create change to this broken system, and it can only be done in a bipartisan way. It's not too late for our friends on the other side of the aisle to work with us to abandon this attempt to do an amnesty by partisan vote on a budget act. It's not too late for them to work with us to address the crisis at hand. And I have a suggestion about a good place to start. Earlier this year, I introduced a bipartisan, bicameral bill with a fellow border state senators, Senator Sinema, called the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act. We've also been proud to work with two of our House colleagues, Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Blue Dog Democrat from Laredo, as the presiding officer knows, having been to Laredo recently, and Tony Gonzalez, who represents the 23rd Congressional District, the largest contiguous congressional district to the U.S.-Mexico border. This legislation makes two modest but important changes to alleviate the strain on law enforcement and improve the way we process and care for these migrants. One would establish 4 regional processing centers in high-traffic areas along the border. These would, in effect, be a one-stop shop for the various government agencies involved in processing the migrants. Migrants can receive medical screenings, have their identities verified, go through a criminal history check, all in one place. And they can also begin the legal process of seeking asylum. They'll complete their credible fear interviews, go through legal orientation, and receive the documents and information they need for their future court date. Right now, in the absence of regional processing centers, that all takes place wherever the bodies come across at a given location along the border. That's what takes the Border Patrol off the front lines, opening up these huge gaps in our border security for illegal drugs to come across. So the very modest step of creating regional process centers will at least help with that. Second, our bill addresses staffing shortages that have made this situation even more challenging. And indeed, that's the goal of these criminal organizations that move millions of migrants across our border. But it will require the hiring of hundreds of Customs and Border Protection officers, can get back on the front lines. This legislation calls for 150 new immigration judges. Given the size of the backlog of the immigration docket, we need more help. We need 300 asylum officers, ICE litigation teams, and other personnel to help adjudicate asylum claims and work through the immigration court backlog. But make no doubt about it, Mr. President, these criminal organizations are smart, they're well organized, and they understand the gaps and know how to exploit them. And it's because they've become expert at exploiting the gaps in the absence of any action by Congress. What we've seen this last year is going to continue into the foreseeable future. What we saw in Del Rio last September will be repeated at some point unless we change the way we handle these migrants. These are common sense reforms, like I said, that have received bicameral and bipartisan support, which for 10 months has completely bewildered the Biden administration. It's not a solution to every problem we're facing today, but it's a place to start. I would yield to anybody who has a better idea or anybody who has any ideas at all. But so far, all we hear from the Biden administration is crickets, pretending like the problem doesn't exist and will hopefully go away. Meanwhile, the president's poll numbers when it comes to the border and illegal immigration continue to plummet. You would think self-interest alone in the political future of the Democratic Party and of this administration would cause them to wake up and decide, hey, what we're doing now isn't working, so let's try something different. Well, I hope that Senate Democrats, who have the majority in the Senate and who set the agenda both here on the floor and in committees, will consider the bipartisan bicameral bill that Senator Sinema and Congressman Cuellar and Gonzalez and I have proposed. Only the chairman of the committee, the Judiciary Committee, can actually set a hearing on a bill and schedule a markup where we can vote on it, we can offer amendments, and shape the bill according to the will of the members of the Senate. But so far, Senator Tillis from North Carolina and I have written a letter to Senator Durbin, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, asking him to hold such a hearing and a markup. We're not suggesting we can dictate the outcome, because every member of the Judiciary Committee would be able to offer any additional suggestions or amendments that they might have, but we're asking them to get off a dime, get out of neutral, and actually do something to help improve the broken situation at the border. Senate committees used to be the usual place for debates on critical issues in legislation. But now it seems like the Democratic chairmen have ceded all of their power to the authors of the reckless tax and spending spree bill that has now passed the House. They complained about which policies were cut out of the latest bill without stopping to consider the fact that they could move these same policies through the normal committee process. After the parliamentarian confirmed that Democrats cannot grant legal status or citizenship through the budget process, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee professed to be deeply disappointed. But he wasn't surprised. He knows the rules as well as anybody else. And it seems disingenuous to me to say he was deeply disappointed in not being able to move immigration law changes through a partisan budget reconciliation process when he himself has the authority to schedule a markup and hearing of a bill that would actually make things better. There's nothing that prevents Chairman Durbin from holding a hearing on these proposals in the Judiciary Committee this week. Make no mistake, Republicans want the Judiciary Committee to start working on legislation to address the failures of our immigration system and not just the border crisis. As I suggested a moment ago, this summer, Senator Tillis from North Carolina and I bill. Deferred action on childhood arrivals that only addresses the active DACA population. We weren't holding these young people who've done nothing wrong but find themselves now in an unstable future because of the litigation that's still pending. We didn't ask for anything for that. We just asked that the Senate Judiciary Committee actually do its job by taking up a bill and voting on a piece of legislation and making it available for floor action. Many of our Democratic colleagues have been promising the Dreamers, sometimes known as the DACA population, same difference. These are people who came across the border illegally as children. But in America, we don't hold children responsible for the mistakes their parents make. And there are many of us on our side of the aisle that would be happy to engage in a discussion and debate and vote on relief and a more stable future for these young people who, as I said, did nothing wrong, but now find themselves in a legal conundrum. These are the young men and women whose fate hangs in the balance of every court ruling for the last 10 years. And the chairman of the Judiciary Committee is advocating giving them legal status. Now he has 2 Republican senators asking him to bring up a bill that achieves that goal, but he refuses. Even went so far as to say he was disappointed we asked him to do his job. Instead, he insists on tying the fate of these young people to the Democrats' impossible-to-pass mass legalization proposal. Our Democratic colleagues seem to think this massive partisan bill is the only way they can prove to voters that they know how to govern, but they got it backwards. In reality, Democrats' burning focus on this one reckless bill has kept them from achieving anything else, including immigration reform. Our colleagues have done nothing to address the border crisis. So far, have done nothing to fund the government, have done nothing to lift the debt ceiling, have done nothing to support our military, or done nothing to meet the Senate's most basic responsibilities. It's true that by virtue of a 50-50 Senate and a Democrat vice president, that our Democratic colleagues control the majority in this body. And they control the majority in the House of Representatives, and they have the White House. But one thing is for sure, this is a far cry from living up to our responsibilities to govern wisely and appropriately for the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.